The Beggar's Bazooka is an unlockable primary weapon for the soldier who already has insane mobility and damage potential with his stock rocket launcher. This amalgamation of assorted garbage dials up the mobility and burst damage to 11. So, if Soldier can quite literally soar to new heights with this weapon, why isn't everyone using it? Well, like the majority of unlocks in Team Fortress 2, the Beggar's Bazooka isn't a direct upgrade from the stock item which it replaces. Instead, it provides unique upsides at the cost of distinct downsides, resulting in an item that is better than stock in some cases and worse in others. The Beggars is one of the best examples of this balancing philosophy in my opinion, and I would consider its design nothing short of genius. As you probably already know, the bazooka functions very differently from the rest of Soldier's primaries. Instead of starting with a number of rockets loaded in the clip, you start with nothing. Upon holding left click, the soldier will start loading rockets and he will continue loading rockets until you release left click. Immediately after unclicking, all loaded rockets are fired in quick succession. The speed at which the rockets are released is notably faster than stock, but is still somewhat controllable with enough practice. That is, you can switch targets in the middle of a barrage of rockets if you are able to flick quickly enough. More on this later. This barrage mechanic is limited to 3 rockets. If you try to load a 4th rocket, it will misfire, causing you to take damage and bringing down the total count of rockets loaded to 2. This will continue to deplete the rest of your clip if you continue holding mouse 1 until the weapon will reset itself to its default state and the process starts over. At a surface level, this seems extremely niche, but it has tons of gameplay implications. Valve probably realized that anything over 3 quick rockets was borderline overpowered and implemented this mechanic to prevent you from, well, using the ×10 beggars in actual games of Team Fortress. Just a random note, I booted up TF2 for what was supposed to be 30 seconds just to get an example of the bazooka in a ×10 server, but I ended up goofing around for 10 minutes because I forgot just how fun horsing around in this mode is.
Soldier to mission control, prepare for takeoff in 3, 2, 1.
Alright, that's enough of that. In actual TF2, misfiring is extremely useful as a movement ability because the damage it deals to you does a lot of knockback if you can time your jump and crouch properly. This is called misfire jumping, and it can be chained into other jumps, such as a 2nd and even 3rd misfire, or even a 2-rocket barrage to get insane speed. The barrage can also be used on its own for some crazy movement tech, but I'm getting ahead of myself. These 2 mechanics, Barrage and Misfire, are the only upsides of the Beggar's Bazooka. As I mentioned in the intro, these upsides generally improve soldiers' movement abilities and burst damage, but they do not come without sacrifice. Firstly, your rockets will have a 20% reduction in explosion radius. While this isn't super noticeable, it does mean you will have to be a bit more precise to deal splash damage, which is made difficult by the second downside. Your rockets have a 3-degree random deviation. At very close ranges, this isn't even noticeable, but at mid and long range, don't expect to be very accurate. Of course, combine this with the 20% area of effect reduction, and you might start to realize the major drawback of the trash gun. You are terrible at long range. Granted, most classes in TF2 are bad at long range by design, but Soldier is typically one of the more effective classes from afar. Stock rockets are still useful for spamming out chokes from a distance, and of course, shooting sentries from outside their range. With the bazooka, this is still theoretically possible, but in practice, the majority of your rockets will miss at anything other than short range. The final downside is that you can't get ammo from dispensers when you have the beggars active. This isn't a big deal at all, just pull out your melee weapon and you will begin to get ammo as you normally would. So, what do you get when you combine all of these aspects? Before I get to the meat and potatoes of this section, there are a few trade-offs in the movement category I want to talk about. I'll go over the specifics for jumping with this launcher in a later section, but it is worth pointing out here that while you generally gain more than you lose, there are some things that the regular rocket launcher can do that the beggars cannot. To generalize though, when you equip the bazooka, you get better rocket jumping than stock. Also, style points for this weapon are through the roof, just throwing that out there. The best way to summarize this item is that you are trading all of your long-range abilities for improved close-range abilities. The random rocket deviation and splash reduction are huge hits. No, misses, when it comes to spamming choke points from afar or taking down a sentry nest. You can throw your hopes and dreams of doing any damage at long distances into the same garbage can where you found the parts for this thing. What you get in return is your time to kill is greatly decreased in many situations. The first and most obvious of these cases is when you unleash 3 rockets onto an unsuspecting target. This is without a doubt significantly faster at killing things than stock, assuming you can land all of the rockets. Somewhat less obvious is the sustain of the bazooka when compared to the rocket launcher or the original. Although it doesn't say it on the item card, and the wiki appears to be straight up incorrect, the Beggar's bazooka can fire single rockets faster than stock can when they are both fully unloaded. Of course, stock doesn't start unloaded, so it greatly outpaces the Beggars for the first 4 rockets, but from the 5th shot and beyond, you can fire faster with the Beggars. Very rarely will fights last long enough for the Beggars to beat out stock, since again the first 4 rockets will be much faster to come out with the rocket launcher. In the times where fights drag on for seemingly forever, then this can become a major upside. Furthermore, you can greatly mitigate the whole start at 0 rockets downside by beginning your engagements with rockets loaded. If you start an engagement with 3 rockets ready to fire, your damage potential will be much greater than a fully loaded stock rocket launcher. Now of course, you won't always be able to guarantee this, but there are definitely ways you can maximize your chances. If we were to graph out the bazooka's damage potential, it would look somewhat sinusoidal. You want to encounter enemies when you have multiple rockets loaded, so at the peaks of your damage potential graph. Conversely, you want to avoid combat when you don't have anything loaded or when you are in the valley. Because your short-term damage potential is as low as you can go by default with the Beggars, you are basically incentivized to perpetually load rockets. If you only ever start loading rockets when you encounter an enemy, your graph might look like this. Obviously, this is a problem because you are never reaching your peak damage potential, thus meaning that anytime you engage an enemy, you will have to take time to load rockets. While in this case, you will be burning through much more ammo, the upsides of this method far outweigh the downsides. Avoiding interactions when you have no rockets ready and seeking them out with the barrage loaded kind of reminds me of Heavy, but instead of wanting to be spun up when you encounter someone, you want to have 3 rockets ready to fire. Putting yourself into this situation as often as possible is paramount because you will be taking advantage of the upsides of this weapon this way, hitting a target with 3 lightning-fast rockets. In a perfect world where you always catch good timings, the Beggars is straight up better than stock at holding doorways or corner peeking players. Unfortunately, not only is it impossible to always get good timing, but the rhythm of this weapon is somewhat exploitable. If a smart opponent realizes you are using the Beggars, they can simply wait for you to fire off your barrage before pushing you. Generally speaking, I try to break line of sight with opponents until I am ready to fight them as a soldier because it protects me from taking damage and usually provides me with a corner to use to my advantage. This also helps a lot with the Beggars for all of those reasons, but also because your opponents won't have the visual cues of you loading rockets, so it's harder to track. You can also change up how many rockets you load before firing them, such as doing a barrage of 3, then 2, then 3, and so on. Of course, you should use these rockets to pre-fire the choke or corner should your opponent decide to push you. I've gotten tons of kills by just doing a good job of micromanaging my constant loading and firing to always pre-fire corners and choke points. Unlike the stock rocket launcher, where you have total control over how many rockets you have, with the Beggars you can't help but be defenseless for a split second as you start to load up again. Partially because of this, and partially because it is more fun, I typically prefer to be on the offensive with the bazooka, even when defending. The best defense is a good offense, right? Well, sort of. As I have already made pretty clear, the trash gun is uniquely good at dive bombing the other team, but similar to the reloading pattern, this too can be used against you. More crafty opponents will realize that your entire strategy is to feed in on repeat and simply play defensively until you feed. Once they get the kill on you, they can do what they want with you on a respawn timer. All of this is to say that despite being situationally the strongest rocket launcher in the game, you still need to play into your strengths effectively and intelligently to achieve the best results. Equally as important is to avoid the weapon's weak spots as much as possible. Arguably, the weakest aspect of this weapon is the fact that you start with 0 rockets ready to fire. The easiest way to avoid this weakness is, as I already said, always be loading. Again, it is impossible to avoid entirely, but you can greatly mitigate your chances of getting caught with 0 in your mag by constantly loading. Walking over to a health pack, load some rockets. Pushing the payload, load some rockets. Holding a doorway, load some rockets. Flying through the air at an unsuspecting sniper, load some rockets. Pushing a flank, you probably should load some rockets. Perhaps this seems obvious and a bit over the top, but I wouldn't repeat myself so many times if it wasn't incredibly important. The entire point of this weapon is to shoot players with a barrage of rockets, so if you aren't constantly setting yourself up for this by just holding mouse 1, then you are doing it wrong. Not only does always loading help prevent you from getting caught off guard, but it also allows you to rocket jump at a whim as well. This is an ability you may take for granted with stock, but with the Beggars, there is no instant rocket jump. Every jump must be premeditated. Even if you didn't initially mean to use that rocket to jump, you still need to start loading it half a second before you actually get to use it. Another reason why you should always be loading is a bit more ethereal, but equally as important in my opinion. Constantly loading will force you to learn the rhythm of the Beggar's Bazooka. I've already pointed out the rhythmic nature of this item, but internalizing this beat is not only essential for maximizing damage potential, but also your movement abilities as well. The most effective range for a Beggar soldier is almost point blank, just far enough away from your target to avoid dealing self-damage. Unfortunately, you cannot simply will your opponents to walk right into your loving arms, so you will have to do something to make this situation occur. Smart positioning is one such way, but this isn't always possible on offense. As a result, I typically turn to an age-old soldier trick, the bomb. Bombing just means rocket jumping with the intent of landing on an opponent, or maybe airstrafing away at last second to be a distraction for your team. With the Beggars, I am usually attempting the former, since this item is uniquely good at such aggressive bombs. I have nicknamed my typical Beggar's Bazooka loadout the ICBM Soldier for what I assume are obvious reasons. Typical do's and don'ts of bombing apply to this weapon. Firstly, you want to bomb high and or fast, ideally both. This is for a number of reasons. You will take less damage from anybody who notices you if you are going fast, and even less if you are high up, because you will be further away. In fact, your enemies might not even notice you at all until it is too late if you are high enough, or if you get a good timing. Furthermore, by bombing high, you will be allowing yourself plenty of airtime to be loading up a barrage of rockets to use when you land on your target. With the stock launcher, in order to sink rockets onto a target, you have to start firing well before landing, but with the Beggars, you can hold your shots until just before landing on your target and still achieve the same result. This is really nice because you don't have to predict your opponent's movement nearly as much. Secondly, when you bomb, you want to be relatively sure that you aren't just feeding. That is, you want the play you are making to have a relatively high chance of succeeding. If you know for sure that there is a sentry gun or a heavy waiting for you at your destination, then you may want to reconsider bombing in. Ideally, you could just spam out a sentry gun before jumping in, but unfortunately your matchup versus Engineer is rough. You go from soft countering Engie with stock to getting soft countered or even hard countered depending on the situation. You can still kill a sentry gun with this item equipped, but it becomes much harder. The interaction reminds me a bit of Demonite, where as a Demonite you can kill a sentry, it just takes way more skill than if you were running stock. Just like Demonite, killing a sentry as a Beggar soldier can often be a Pyrrhic victory. You kill the sentry, but you don't get much other value before you get traded. The stock rocket launcher can, ignoring both of the Engineer's incredibly frustrating secondary unlocks, single-handedly destroy a sentry from outside its range without putting yourself at too much risk. With the Beggars, you are forced to close the distance if you want to kill the gun in a reasonable amount of time. Good luck spamming out a sentry when you are more than 2 meters away with the Beggars, because half of your rockets will fly by harmlessly. The level of frustration that a sentry gun will provide depends on the context, since there are plenty of spots that you can just ignore. Other times, you will do a sick jump only to be met with the world's dumbest sentry spot. There isn't really much you can do about this as an individual, so just be prepared to have this happen sometimes. I guess that sums up my problems with the engineer class. I can't stand it when I am completely forced to change the way I like to play just because not a single player on my team can switch to demo and kill the sentry gun that is preventing me from doing anything. What I just said about sentries largely applies to heavies, although in many cases you can get away with bombing a heavy if their aim is bad enough or if they are spun down.
Dude, did you guys see that heavy?
Also, jumping at a good scout or a really good pyro will also end poorly for you, although these guys are significantly rarer than sentries and heavies in my experience. That is, the vast majority of scouts and pyros are free strange farm. Anyways, back to bombing. Another good practice is to land on high ground whenever possible. High ground makes you a harder target and makes hitting splash rockets much easier. Also, in the context of bombing, you might take less fall damage, and your target may not even notice you because TF2 players still don't look up in 2025. An aspect of bombing that is unique to this unlock is that your bombs are far more committal than with other rocket launchers. With stock, I can bomb in with 2 rockets, reload 1 midair, shoot another 2 to get the frag, and then retreat with the final rocket. You can still run away after a bomb with the Beggars, but doing so will be harder because you will always end up with 0 rockets loaded. As a result, trading is a pretty frequent occurrence for an ICBM soldier. Just like a roamer with stock and gunboats, dying isn't a huge deal as long as you are getting a favorable trade for your team, such as a medic or a cracked demo or sniper. Many times you will be able to get multiple picks, which is even better. Of course, the most valuable pick is almost always going to be the other team's top scoring player, but every game is different and you will have to rely on your own intuition to decide whether or not a trade is worth it. With this item, one thing is certain. You are very capable of saying fuck you to one guy in particular and taking him down with you as long as you are good enough at rocket jumping. Alright, I've spent a lot of time rambling on about how great the Beggars is at bombing, but many of you might not be familiar with all of the things you can pull off when it comes to jumping with this thing. I'm going to assume that you are somewhat familiar with rocket jumping with stock. If you aren't, then you may want to learn some rocket jumping basics before continuing to pursue the Beggars because you will probably learn quicker that way. I'll start with the most basic jumps and work my way up to the more difficult ones. Firstly, there is the single rocket jump that is essentially identical to stock and its derivatives. There isn't much to say here other than it takes slightly longer because you have to actually load the rocket first. When I initially started learning this weapon, this was one of the 2 jumps that I ever really used, and while I tend to prefer the more flashy things now, this regular old jump is still useful for general mobility. I would advise against using this jump to bomb any players, however, because you won't be getting much higher speed, so you also won't have any rockets loaded by the time you land. The only time that bombing at a player with this type of jump is useful is if you intend to market garden them. Next up, we have the double wall jump. This is relatively easy to pull off, and it is one of my personal favorites because of how versatile it is. The end result of this type of bomb is the same as a double wall jump with stock, but performing the jump is slightly different. Just load up 2 rockets and shoot the first rocket at the floor and move your mouse over to the wall to get some horizontal momentum. You don't need to shoot the first rocket at the floor, but I find doing this allows me the most control over my jump. Speaking of control, you can trade more height for more speed depending on where you aim your second rocket. This is difficult at first if you aren't used to the rate at which your barrage fires, but with practice you can get good at aiming your second rocket in order to adjust your trajectory. While walls on the right are preferred, you can still perform this with a left-handed wall. You can either start backwards or flick really hard going forwards. The reason I like this type of jump is because, unlike the stock rocket launcher that needs a sizable wall to pull off, you can use a relatively small wall to get tons of height. If you have a big wall, that's great, but the ability to use a tiny wall to bomb super high is incredibly useful. Using Badwater last as an example, there are tons of locations you can high bomb with the Beggar's Bazooka that you can't with stock. Another example is this wall on upward third, which is normally not tall enough to do a high bomb with. In my anecdotal experience, very few soldiers high bomb in casual, so your opponent will probably not expect you to sink rockets onto them after you high bomb off some tiny wall that stock soldier couldn't high bomb with in the first place. You will need a larger wall to do the next jump, a triple wall jump. This is exactly the same as the double, but instead you will load up a 3 rocket barrage. This maneuver will net you an insane amount of height, but in the majority of cases it honestly is not worth the extra health cost to perform. This wall on Badwater First is an example of a spot where you can do this. Note that the skybox needs to be very high so that you don't hit your head. I think the main appeal here is for style points, such as using it to lead into a sink. Next up is a jump that is completely unique to this gun, the misfire. This can be performed by attempting to load a 4th rocket into your clip. You will have to jump and crouch like you would a regular rocket jump and look in the opposite direction you want to travel in. The explosion acts like a rocket that hits an invisible wall right in front of you, so if you want height, you will have to aim down a little bit. When I did my 100-day challenge, getting the misfire timing down to a T was the inflection point in my Beggar's jumping journey. Once I could consistently do a good misfire jump, I quickly learned the rest of the basics. I bring this up because the timing will make or break your jump. If you feel like you aren't getting nearly as much height as you should when doing this, I guarantee it is because you are jump crouching too early like I was. Learning the rhythm of this weapon takes a bit of time, but if you stick with it, it will come to you. When I was talking about a regular old single rocket jump, I mentioned that you should probably avoid using it to bomb an opponent. Using a misfire instead is usually desirable because you will have another 2 rockets ready to go as you are flying through the air. You can also use these rockets to combo into more jumps. The first of such combos is the misfire into another misfire. This is the same concept as misfiring on the ground, so I don't have much advice to give other than to just try it. You will figure it out. One example of this in practice is the Badwater First rollout, where you do a misfire into a wall jump. Another thing you can do after a misfire is using a barrage of 2 rockets. Misfire into a double wall jump for a crazy fast rollout is one example. The same concept applies to pogoing as well. Pogos are similarly useful for bombing or rolling out. If you do this into a slight incline, you will get both speed as well as crazy height. The main limiting factor for many of these jumps is the skybox. What you choose to do with all this speed and height is up to you. Typically, I try to sink rockets onto an enemy, although you can do a sink jump if you so choose. I find this to be extremely impractical, but if you're making a frag montage, go for it. Another application of the misfire into a 2 rocket barrage is the classic sink rock, although whatever you are sinking rockets onto doesn't need to be a rock. Unlike the other example I have given where you essentially use the rockets to either pogo or wall jump, in this case you will have to release the barrage a bit sooner so that you are getting hit with both rocket explosions at the same time. The resulting jump is both flashy and effective because you should in theory get lots of height and or speed. The final distinct jump I want to mention looks like this. I'm not sure what to call it other than a pogo, although it's not really the same application as what we are used to with stock. Anyways, this motion is not very useful on its own, but you can use it to gain speed to chain into other jumps. If you are anything like me, you will probably struggle with many of these jumps at first. If you saw my 100 days with the Beggars video, you may remember what got me on track: jump maps. While loading up a map in the casual rotation and just freestyling can help, I found that playing through some levels on Jump Academy 2 was the fastest way for me to improve. More specifically, I played through easy walls, easy pogo, medium walls, and a bit of medium pogo. I'll include a quick cut here of a medium walls playthrough, mostly because I would highly recommend playing through the map once or twice to those interested in improving at Beggar's jumping. I am by no means a top tier jumper, far from it, but I would say I'm maybe a bit above average. This run took me a little under 5 minutes. Some of these jumps are somewhat pointless, but I think of it like wax on, wax off from Karate Kid if you've seen that, where sometimes you have to do seemingly meaningless tasks to fully master something. I would say the majority of these jumps are actually pretty applicable to a real game. The first and the third are similar to the Badwater First fast rollout, and the fourth and fifth jumps are essentially double wall jump practice. The 12th jump has potential on some maps, but I have not gotten consistent enough to truly use it to its full potential, or at all, I guess. I think that the appeal of sitting down and doing these jump maps, other than them being pretty fun, is that the majority of these jumps are way harder than what you will be doing in-game. This means that when it comes time to actually play, you will be spending way less effort actually performing the inputs and rather focusing on your aim and decision making. Of course, if you feel like it isn't worth it, that is totally up to you, and I will certainly admit that waddling with the Beggar's Bazooka can still be a viable strategy, albeit a limited one. If you have been watching my videos for a while now, you have probably heard me say that health is a resource. As a soldier player, you have a lot of options when it comes to managing your health, such as health packs and the Conqueror. Unfortunately for you, the only way to get overhealed is from a friendly medic's medigun. I've already made it pretty clear that bombing as a Beggar's soldier is pretty good, and starting a bomb with 300 health instead of 200 can and will literally save your life, or make the difference between securing an important pick or dying for nothing. Unfortunately, many pub medics seem to be unable to grasp the simple concept of crit buffing their combat classes so they can bomb in, and would rather heal a full health heavy. Despite this game being old enough to vote in the United States, this type of medic is shockingly common. Like, I get that not everyone is as much of a tryhard as me, but playing medic is just way more fun if you are actively spreading heals around instead of just following around some guy like a bot. Anyways, when you are blessed with a medic who can be bothered to press mouse 1 on you occasionally, thank Gaben because your bombs will be much more effective should you choose to bomb. Obviously, an overheal benefits every single class, but I find that Beggar's soldiers disproportionately benefit from getting overhealed. Firstly, bombing is kind of your MO, and bombing does self-damage, so in a way you're getting a free jump when you are buffed. Secondly, you actually have pretty good sustain during a team fight because of the faster rocket reloads, so by living longer you can provide your team more value. Speaking of sustain, your ability to sneeze out rockets every half a second also makes you a pretty good Uber target. Actually, because of the barrage mechanic, the Beggars might be better suited for getting Ubered than a stock soldier with gunboats because you can brute force your way through a Pyro's air blast. Another nice upside to the Beggar's Uber is that the invincibility can be used to mitigate the Bazooka's weaknesses. I try to get as close as possible to my targets, ideally at point blank, to completely avoid the chance of one of my rockets missing because of the random spread, as well as to get the maximum damage ramp up. A further example of the viability of these Ubers is the post-Uber. Because you can shoot rockets so quickly when compared to an unloaded rocket launcher, you have a bit more breathing room in the post. A 300 health soldier at point blank after the other team was forced to kite to worse positioning is a force to be reckoned with. As you would imagine, the Kritzkrieg pairs well with this weapon too. Unlike Uber, I think Stock Soldier is a much better crits target because he has more reliable long-range damage, and of course the Beggars struggle at ranges, but still don't underestimate a barrage of crit rockets. I want to take a moment to thank all of the medics who actually spread heals around the team instead of just healing their one friend. I dream that one day, every single medic in my casual games will have seen at least one Mr. Slin or Theory Y video, but for the time being, I am stuck with like 50% of meds, still drinking the overdose is actually good Kool-Aid, or, just like healing some random frickin' heavy. If any of you are watching this, please overheal me when you see me, or not just me, like your whole team. It's really not that hard, and it'll make things easier for you and your whole team if you just spread the heals around. And if you use the vaccinator, well, I have nothing nice to say to you. I guess I should also say that as a Beggar soldier who is probably running gunboats, don't over-rely on your medics. Sometimes it is better to play a more flank playstyle and rely on health packs to sustain you instead of being another low health player for your poor medic to take care of. Actually, I much prefer to play on the flank as a soldier. Combo Soldier can be good, as I have obviously shown, but if your team has classes that are already playing that role, then you are free to roam the flank. Speaking of flanks, pretty much all maps have what are called flanks, which is just a fancy way of saying an alternate path that is separate from the main door or choke point. Some of the maps that have community callouts have a designated area that is the flank, but in most cases what is actually the flank is not carved in stone and depends on the game state. As a Beggar soldier, you are able to roam around the map because of your incredible movement abilities. In fact, I think of the Beggar soldier as a roamer soldier on steroids. It is often a good idea to take advantage of your jumps and either pressure the other team from a flank or use an open flank to get behind. In either case, when you do this right, you are providing your team with an incredibly important tool that is often overlooked in casual: split pressure. The battle on one single front is generally very easy for the defending team, which traditionally has a positional advantage because of how maps are designed. Take Dust Bowl for an example, a map that is notorious for being red-sided. This map has one main doorway and in some cases literally no flanks. I avoid playing maps like this because they promote a very boring playstyle, at least to me. If you like eternal stalemates, then eat your heart out. Anyways, I prefer maps with flanks that allow for more dynamic and fast-paced gameplay. Other than having a bit more open spaces, maps that promote this also have flanks that provide the blue team with options to break a red hold, while also giving red opportunities to use the flank to punish overextended blue players. This design philosophy means that there are a number of ways for both teams to play, meaning that you will have to be more flexible, and as a Beggar soldier, this means you will have opportunities to get value out of the movement that you worked hard to master. Now, it's worth mentioning that in many cases, the movement abilities of the trash gun actually render the need for an unguarded flank obsolete. In tandem with the gunboats, which I'll talk about later, the Beggars is one of the best items for going behind, second to only the sticky jumper and the rocket jumper. Using my precious Badwater as an example, you can straight up bomb so fast on first as the blue team that there isn't much red can do to stop you from going behind unless they were expecting you to do so far in advance. When you get behind, you have a few options. Arguably the best option is to collapse onto the other team as your team pushes so that they are forced to fight a battle on two fronts. The problem with this is that in casual, it requires some coordination and your team actually has to do something which doesn't always happen. Another option is to go kill teleporters and or spawn camp, which can be effective, albeit map dependent. Lastly, you can just lurk behind and look for easy kills and be ready to collapse should your team decide to actually go do something. This is usually my choice, and even if my team never pushes, I can often get lots of value. Sometimes when you are behind, players will chase you. In this situation, I will often just lead them on a fruitless chase by jumping from pack to pack. Not only are these situations hilarious, and the Benny Hill theme ought to be playing in the background, but they are also helping your team. This is because you are effectively keeping your pursuers on a permanent respawn timer because they are being completely useless. This is really only worth it if you have 2 or more players chasing you, but if it's just one guy, you can bait them into a bad fight and secure the frag. If a player is willing to chase you to the ends of the earth, they will usually ignore all of the fundamentals and be pretty easy to blindside with a barrage of rockets. You don't have to go behind to be a successful flanker, and in some cases going behind is actually a bad play because, well, sometimes the other team is playing really weird and will have a sentry waiting for you or some other stupid crap. Also, sometimes map geometry will simply not allow you to be behind the other team. Think pushing upward last. You can't go into red spawn, so it's essentially impossible to be behind players who are in pub spot. Instead of going behind, you can just try to pressure from a different angle from the bulk of your team. This could just mean pushing a flank and taking fights there, or perhaps realizing there's an opening and doing a high bomb to land on players that are looking at your main push. In either case, the Beggar's Bazooka is well suited to this flank playstyle because of the movement options it provides you. You have the freedom to dive in should the need arise, but you also have enough firepower to be a threat when you are just waddling. Similar to being behind, you want to pressure a flank when the rest of your team is also pressuring the main choke when possible. Okay, in this section, I mostly want to focus on timing your pushes and bombs, but I would be doing a disservice if I ignored mentioning positioning in this guide. Because I have been repeating these fundamentals on my channel ad nauseum for the last year or two, I'm going to keep this brief. If you want a more in-depth positioning talk, see my soldier positioning video. Anyways, let me quickly ramble off some fundamentals. Playing on high ground whenever possible is important. Not only are you harder to hit, but you also are more easily able to splash enemies. Being near health packs gives you advantages in 1v1s because a pack can act as additional health if you grab it during a fight, and they can also introduce ways to bait out an enemy's shot by faking that you are going for the pack and strafing away at the last second. Soldier is really good at holding choke points, and you will want to be fighting your opponents when they are in a choke point whenever possible. This, when combined with other fundamentals such as high ground and health packs, will compound into some of the easiest kills of your career. With the Beggars, an additional variable is added to the equation. You want to fight enemies in a choke point when you have 2 or 3 rockets loaded. Lastly, I already talked about it in the previous section, but use flanks to your advantage to apply split pressure or open up opportunities to bomb. Speaking of bombing, I have already discussed the mechanics of bombing, as well as some good practices such as landing on height and avoiding sentries, scouts, heavies, and pyros. I have not yet talked about the decision making you will need to go through to determine whether or not to bomb. The first of many variables in this equation is your team. If your team is very good, then they will be both directly helping you by giving you buffs or turning your 2v1s into 2 or 3v1s, but they will also be indirectly helping you by getting frags and applying pressure to the other team. I won't go into detail about map control and pressure in this video because I plan on making a whole separate video on these concepts, but even if you don't fully understand what I am referring to, you can feel it in the game. When your team is doing very well, you will be able to get away with a lot more. When you bomb, you will encounter much less resistance, so bombing is pretty much always worth it if you are healthy. A far more common scenario is when your team is about equally matched with the opposition, or worse. In this case, you will have to be much more choosy with your bombs. In these lobbies, just ripping a bomb into the other team will usually get you killed, or maybe you will get lucky and get a single frag before you get traded. Instead, you should try to wait for your team to pressure before you go in. Oftentimes you can spot this by just seeing your team starting to peek, but if you are somewhere without line of sight, you can use your HUD to tell you when to go. Sometimes you will see that your team is pushing the cart, or maybe the kill feed has a lot of friendly frags. Another situation that bombing is advisable is when you see that you or your team just got a key pick. Maybe a sentry gun that was stopping you from high bombing just went down, or maybe a problematic heavy was just sent to the respawn room. One situation where pushing or bombing is advisable is when the other team is overextended. This is relevant for both offense and defense, but if you see that the other team is very forward or positioned very poorly, then you can push your advantage and punish them. If you are unsure of how to spot this, think of the opposite of good positioning fundamentals. In a choke point, on low ground, in a corner, etc. Because casual is essentially a 12v12 random number generator, it is impossible to list all of the variables in a video, but as long as you are practicing and paying attention when you are playing, you will build up a sense for both positioning as well as timed aggression. This is probably a good spot to mention choosing your fights. Since you have a lot of movement options, you inherently have the ability to run away from unfavorable matchups. Now, I'll be the first to admit that my own fight picking ability could use some tuning, because I will occasionally commit to a fight that is stacked against me despite totally having the option to just jump away. However, having good mechanics can definitely bail you out a lot of the times. Just like positioning and timing, this is a skill you will build over time, but I can give some general advice focused on the Beggar's Bazooka. There are a few matchups I think are noticeably impacted by equipping this weapon. Firstly, when you catch a scout off guard, the fight is even more stacked in your favor because you can sometimes essentially one-shot him. However, in most scenarios, I think the scout's chances against you are improved compared to a stock soldier because of the Beggar's reduced splash radius. I have a newfound appreciation for the default rocket's insane AoE now that I have been using the Beggar's Bazooka for a while. As I mentioned previously, your matchup versus Engineer kind of sucks, so I apologize in advance for the annoyance you will experience. I hate Engineer, man. I think that, while still generally favorable towards the Soldier, the matchup versus Heavy is slightly worse. You can still win relatively easily by using corners to your advantage, but your reduced abilities at mid to long range mean you have less of an advantage than before. However, you have better burst damage, so you can almost one-shot a heavy with a single barrage. Your Pyro battles are still also in your favor in my opinion, although the rhythm of the Beggar's Bazooka is somewhat predictable and exploitable. If the Pyro is good, your best bet is to just try and avoid them. Lastly, I think Soldier versus Soldier is slightly worse for you. Again, it's really difficult to quantify these matchups exactly because there are so many variables. But because of the Beggar's Bazooka's oscillating damage potential, the outcome of the fight will often depend on subtle differences in timing. The reason I have stock as slightly favored is because it is more reliable at most ranges, as well as for air shots. It wouldn't be a complete guide video without mentioning trades, and this unlock is extremely good at getting them. If you didn't know, a trade is just trading your life for one or more picks. Naturally, a medic pick is the most desirable, although in some cases, such as a post-uber, focusing a combat class is going to be better. As has been typical throughout this video, the bazooka generally follows the rules with a few considerations and caveats. Getting a trade for a sniper or demo is usually good, although it will always boil down to the skill of the player who is controlling those classes. Trading your life for the free-to-play sniper who is spamming your team with the SMG from across the map just isn't worth it, but getting the guy terrorizing your team is worthwhile. Some trades that are usually not worth are spies, heavies, pyros, and demo knights, but again, if they are top scoring the other team, then that may change. Now, because the Beggars can do a really fast 3-rocket barrage, and you can load most of those rockets as you are careening through the air, I actually think that getting just one kill before getting traded is actually quite subpar. I find I am usually able to get at least 2 frags before dying, as long as my bomb was heeding the advice of the previous section. I should also mention that you don't necessarily have to even bomb to secure a trade, although that is what most people picture when discussing the subject. Sometimes you may just shove a flank and spot an opportunity too good to ignore and just waddle in as you menacingly load up your salvo of shots. I think that the Beggar's Bazooka helps Soldier live up to his name. Obviously, you should value your life because you are more useful alive than dead, but at the end of the day, a soldier is just a pawn to be used and sometimes sacrificed for the greater good. Classes like Engineer, Demo, Medic, and Sniper are generally trying to stay alive, but that isn't the case for Soldier. Sometimes it is your duty to go die to help further your team's progress towards completing your objective, killstreak be damned, and the Beggars helps provide the tools to do so. Speaking of the tools you have at your disposal, I know this section is a bit buried in the video, and while I normally would put it much earlier, with the Beggars, the gunboats are practically stapled to my feet, and the Market Gardener is my melee of choice. However, I think that there are a few items that you could consider equipping instead of the gunboats and the crit shovel. Firstly, the banners are all incredible in their own respect, so if you ever find yourself playing a more enclosed map like Steel, they are a viable option. With all the freedom you have when it comes to rocket jumping, it almost seems sacrilege to unequip the gunboats, but ultimately the decision is yours. Perhaps more reasonable is unequipping the Market Gardener, which I should point out combos extremely well with the whole crazy movement shtick the Beggars has got going on. If you want to experiment, then I would recommend the Disciplinary Action because it is probably the strongest melee weapon in the game. Also, the escape plan is good, but because you will occasionally be pulling out your melee for dispenser ammo, the Marked for Death downside actually matters for this item, so I tend to avoid it. Alright, if you have made it this far in the video, I really appreciate it. I want to quickly rattle off a ton of tiny things I have learned about the Beggars that are too awkward to fit anywhere else in the video. I apologize for the scattered nature of this section, but it is a weird item, so it has a lot of weird edge cases. Firstly, and probably the most important, you will often be in a situation where you are at 0 rockets spamming single rockets. Sometimes it can be tempting to continue to mash M1 and shoot 1 rocket at a time, but in many cases it is advisable to load 2 or even 3. By loading additional rockets, you can bait an opponent into trying to surf, or make them fail to bait out a shot. Other times, it is worth it to shoot just 1 single rocket, like if you are sure if you can secure the frag, so you will have to decide in a moment. Typically, you will misfire upon loading your 4th rocket, however, if you have only 2 rockets remaining, you will misfire on your 3rd load. This is almost never going to happen, and in my 150 hours or so of using this item in the past few months, I have literally never had this be an issue, but I suppose it is plausible that this can happen to you in-game. Speaking of ammo, the beggars absolutely chews through ammo if you are following the always be loading advice, so you are going to want to keep an eye on your ammo reserves more than usual. Hopefully you can avoid the niche 3 rocket misfire tidbit I just mentioned by frequently topping off your reserves with packs, and as I mentioned earlier, you can still get ammo from dispensers and payloads by pulling your secondary or melee out. This is an entirely useless piece of knowledge, but yet I still want to point it out because I have never seen this in my many thousands of hours of playing TF2 until recently. You can actually still rocket jump with this thing after your team loses the game and you hold up your arms to surrender. You just have to start loading rockets right as you are about to lose and continue left clicking as you normally would. Then you can still rocket jump, and I suppose you could even get a kill in a real game doing this if you played your cards right and got lucky. This is equally as cheesy, but a bit more useful in an actual game. You can use looping taunts such as the conga or the high five to basically store a barrage of rockets. Once you are ready, just untaunt. Hey, it's future editing me just interjecting here. I wrote this before Squiddy G's recent video came out. Great job with that video, by the way, if you are watching, Squiddy. I just wanted to say that this video was already pretty much completely written by the time I saw his video, so the fact I am bringing up these last 2 points is purely coincidence. And not to be a Debbie Downer, but I think stock is overall better than the beggars, but that's just my opinion. Anyways, that is about all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed the video.
Dude, my team is like all fresh installs. This guy, man.
That's it, man.
What is he looking at?
Go, go, go.